Okay, so we're going to start at 6:30 sharp. My name's Liam Delaney. I'm head of the Department of Psychological and Behavioural Science. You're very welcome, or welcome back to LSE, or if you're already in LSE, welcome to the event tonight. We have a very exciting panel session here tonight here on the West End of London with our all-star cast here. There's a lot of people to thank, and I'll try to do it as briefly as I can, but as always, thanks to the LSE Events team for just the extraordinary job they do more generally, and what they've done here again tonight in creating this event. To Ellie Finley in the Institute of Data Science, and Corinne Gay in the Department of Psychological and Behavioural Science for all the work they've done in putting this together. It's a joint event between the Department of Psychological and Behavioural Science and the Institute of Data Science, and obviously thank our panellists, but we'll have a chance to do that at the end. And thanks to Dario Krpan and Michie, who really have, can't tell you how many times they've pestered me and others to get this event done over the last couple of years, so I'm delighted to see their vision coming to fruition. So I hope we have a really fun, stimulating, interesting event tonight. My role will largely be just to tee it up and chair questions from the panel, and then take questions both from the audience here and folks at home. I guess I could start with a quote from, many of you know Amos, the late great Amos Tversky, and I'm sure some of you will already preempt the quote that I'm about to say. When asked about artificial intelligence, he said, well, I study decision making and cognition, so essentially I don't study artificial intelligence, I study natural human stupidity. And I think it's interesting for two reasons. One is, of course, there's this interplay between the creation of these hyper-rational, cognitively awesome machines, and then how humans behave and how humans reason. And I think to talk about that tonight will be fascinating. But the second reason I chose the quote, even though it's a quote many of you will have heard, it's nearly 50 years ago since he said it. And he said it in a kind of a way as if to suggest, look, will we stop talking about artificial intelligence? There's too much of it at this stage. And it goes to show that these topics are not necessarily new. And I think one thing that would be very interesting to speak about tonight is to what extent are we genuinely going through a new juncture in the connection between behavioural science and artificial intelligence. One that has a long history. We can think of people like Herbert Simon, we can think of all of these great thinkers who've looked at it, and all of the great things that have happened when we combine those two things. And I think one thing I'm certainly hoping to hear tonight, I'm sure the audience will stimulate questions, the panel will stimulate many things, is are there genuinely exciting advances in this area? So stuff that we can genuinely be excited by as artificial intelligence, behavioural science combine, in terms of commercial applications, policy improvements in how we regulate products, all of this sort of stuff. And then, of course, are there things we need to be wary of? How much of this will be, as I say to many of you in the classes, don't be creepy. So how much of this will be creepy, manipulative, potentially exploitative? Are there things we should be concerned about? And are there ways to embed that into how we regulate these interactions and think about these interactions? So I think that's pretty much enough from me. So we've got an incredible panel, and I'm going to ask each in turn just to introduce themselves and say a little about their thoughts on it, and then we'll do some questions, and then if you can think both online and in person of interesting things to ask, we'll then kick over to you. So I'm going to begin with Robert West.
Great, thank you very much. And it's great to be here, and it's great to see such a great audience. I feel like it's Elvis Presley. Anyway, so I'm Robert West. I'm a Professor Emeritus of Health Psychology at University College London in the Department of Behavioural Science and Health. And I've been working with Professor Susan Michie on a thing called the Human Behaviour Change Project, which has been going for about the last 6 or 7 years, which is an attempt to harness the power of AI to essentially to take behavioural science forward in very specific ways. What I wanted to do just by introduction was to make a couple of points. One was that in case any of you were under any illusions, AI and machine learning is much more than large language models and generative AI. I know that they've kind of hit the public imagination and they've created some very useful tools, but there's a whole lot of stuff going on that isn't in that genre, which is incredibly important. So that's just a sort of reminder for any of you who might have been sort of really focusing on generative AI and large language models. The second thing is just to give you a broad overview of, I think, where we are in the application of AI as a tool. Not, and I'm not going to talk about the use of AI, other people are going to talk about the use of AI as a way of modelling human cognition and human behaviour, but essentially, in what we're seeing now already is the useful application of AI in all aspects of the research ecosystem, all the way through from topic finding and gap analysis, whether it's in behavioural sciences or in chemistry or in clinical medicine, in gap analysis. It's becoming very useful in developing interventions, new interventions and giving you ideas for things that you might want to test in terms of behaviour change techniques, in terms of modes of delivery. It's becoming very useful in terms of even of the way we write up our papers increasingly. And I want to introduce a term to you if you've not come across it, and then you can look it up, of ontologies, not ontology, which is a philosophical concept, but ontologies, which are computer science artifacts, which act as a Rosetta Stone between humans and computers to allow us to be able to talk in a much more structured way about what we do when we're writing up our papers and analysing the data. All the way through to, obviously, to evidence synthesis, which is already being very much enhanced and helped by AI, not just generative AI, but more traditional ML and AI, all the way through then to policy and how you use the data and the results of findings. But I just want to finish by saying we're right at the beginning. This is absolutely at the beginning of what I think is going to be an exponential explosion in the use of AI in this area, because you can already see where the advances are likely to be.
Good evening. I'm Susan Michie, and I'm Director of the Centre for Behaviour Change at UCL. I want to start by saying why I got interested in AI and why I began collaborating with computer scientists. For 8 years, I was on the Public Health Interventions Advisory Committee of NICE, which is the organisation that develops guidelines for public health and our health service. And it was based on reviews of evidence. And this was so slow and partial, and I really didn't have confidence in the evidence-based recommendations that were being made. Plus, they were being made for populations that were very different than often the populations that the studies were using in terms of producing evidence. Also, I was frustrated by the slow advance of behavioural science itself. And when you looked at what was being done, how things were being reported, our studies are reported in a very partial way. We all have our own language. We're often ambiguous or unclear in terms of what actually we mean. And also we work in silos, disciplinary silos, topic silos. And this means it's really hard to bring together evidence. And we need to accumulate evidence efficiently and quickly if we're going to advance. So partly it was the very slow pace of human beings, and partly it was the fact that we're not reporting our research in ways that are helpful. And so I realised that what we need to do is be able to do what we're doing accurately, at scale, and at speed. And so we needed to be able to make our evidence computer readable, which means making all the constructs and entities that we use, all the relationships between them, have unique IDs. And this is where, as Robert introduced, the word ontologies comes in, ways of representing knowledge. By doing that, one can not only, and using machine learning and artificial intelligence more broadly, one can not only, first of all, find the literature, but also integrate and synthesize more efficiently, but also, importantly, predict from what we know to what we don't know. So, as I said before, where is no, I didn't say it before, but where is most of the research done in the world? In the global north. Where are the massive problems in terms of health, sustainability, etc., in the global south? We don't have, in behavioural science, sophisticated theories of how you can generalise across many different dimensions from what we know to what we don't know. So this is a real problem. And by getting data at scale, one can then use AI and machine learning to really be able to detect patterns in complex data and also predict novel scenarios. And so in the Human Behaviour Change Project, this is what we did. We developed the Behaviour Change Intervention Ontology, which has many thousands of constructs with many levels of in hierarchies and many different relationships. This enables you to be it gives a structure for representing either written reports or data sets themselves in order to be able to really be able to answer very complex questions about what works, for whom, in what situations, for how long, for what behaviours, etc., etc. So we've developed a kind of proof of principle prediction tool which policymakers and others can use. Very importantly, it's actually interpretable, rules-based. So it's not a black box. We didn't want to just have black boxes. We wanted for it to be able to be understood and seen, where you are able to, we've done smoking cessation just as an example, you're able to put in the outcomes you want. You can look at different combinations of techniques that you can put in for different populations, settings, etc. So I think this has a huge potential for the future. As human beings, you know, we aren't comprehensive, we are ambiguous, and the human language is wonderful and the nuances are wonderful. But if we're really going to be scientists, we have to know what each other mean. We have to be able to join knowledge and data across all these different boundaries. So I think there's huge potential for AI, for behavioural science, and I think we should embrace it.
Great. Thank you. Hi, everyone. It's great to be here. I'm Alex Chesterfield. I have led behavioural science teams now for the last 15 years. I feel very old in private sector and public sector. I'm currently at a bank leading a team, but will be very much speaking in a personal capacity tonight. And I was formerly at the financial regulator in their behavioural economics team. I'm also a PhD researcher at LSE using lots of these tools as part of my research, and I've also published a book on polarisation, which I'll come back to shortly. And how I got into this area is I studied cognitive science, again, a long time ago. So I had the privilege of working with lots of computer scientists, and that crossover between how do machines work, how do machines learn versus how humans learn was fascinating. So, speaking from a very practical perspective, I broadly see three paths, I think, where behavioural scientists will increasingly use AI. And I'm going to especially focus my comments on generative AI. So, to Robert's point, it's very big, but I'm going to focus on this tiny subset. And I think it can really progress both policy, practice, and the research field itself. So these three paths are, I think the first one is what I call AI for social science. So here I think the focus is on how can generative AI improve social science. So how can it help us to better understand, explain, and also change human behaviour and do it more quickly? I think that's the first path. I think the second path is what I describe as the social science of AI. So here the focus is on investigating the psychology of AI. So how do large language models, for example, differ from traditional human behaviour? What do large language models do better than humans? Where might we use one over the other? And I don't think we know quite yet. And just as we study now, humans, we study primates. We were talking before about your background in developmental psychology, researching with kids. In the future, you can imagine studying also AI as another species. The third path I see is the social science of AI and human interaction. So how and to what extent does AI influence human behaviour when we are interacting with computers? So here the kinds of questions that I think are very relevant and interesting from an applied perspective are, in which context do people prefer to communicate to a bot than they do to a human? How does communicating to a bot affect both what you share, but also then how you act on that information? So very, very briefly, I'm just going to focus a bit more on that first path and give you a couple of very practical examples, both on how I think it can help us, but also where the harm, again, I'm from a risk background, so I'm going to be going big on the harm. So just on that first path, this is the one around how we can use AI to improve social science. On the helping side, I think there's a huge opportunity in how we can use generative AI for analysing text. So around 80% of the data in most organisations is unstructured, and most of that is text. So when people talk about big data, I think what they're really talking about is big qualitative data. But in the past, the gold standard for analysing text has been humans, but that is so expensive, it takes a long time, and you can never analyse all the data that you can get your hands on. But now some of these tools or technologies means that you can get the equivalent quality to human coders, but in at least 50% less of the time. So I think there are huge opportunities here for how you can use these tools to measure and understand company culture, how you can understand things like customer experience, trust across time, across organisations, between functions. I also think there's a bunch of really interesting opportunities around changing behaviour. There's also lots of risk. But some of the early studies I've seen have been really, really exciting. So we were talking about, there's a Dave Rand study before, which I know some of my team have sent me. And Dave Rand, he's at MIT, and he showed that after discussion with an AI chatbot, so 3 turns of conversation, individuals reported a 20% average reduction in the strength of their beliefs in conspiracy theories, and that effect was maintained after 3 months. So these are like incredible effects, and just think about what else we could do with that. But many of these opportunities also bring huge risks. So one of the reasons why these tools are so good is they can impersonate humans very scarily, very well. But this same capability can also mean lots of problems. So just think about how these tools might fuel misinformation, polarization, fraud and scams, which are already a huge, huge problem. And also just risks because of how they're created. So things like interpretability, bias, inconsistency in output. So these bugs or features, wherever you decide to frame them, might exacerbate existing problems in the field, but also create a whole bunch of new ones. So for me, I think the focus for behavioural scientists needs to be actually what new guidelines or frameworks do we need to be thinking about where AI can harm as well as help. So to sum up, I am super excited at these opportunities, but there is so much that we don't know yet. So collectively, I think we have a lot to learn. And I think to ensure that the future of AI and behavioural science is not one of lots of problems, but instead is one of progress, we need to be asking that question now about those frameworks and those ethical guidelines or guardrails to make sure we don't end up in a mess.
Perfect.
Great. Thank you. Well, firstly, it's wonderful to be here. Thank you to LSE for putting on this event. I'm Liz Costa. I'm the Chief of Innovation and Partnerships at the Behavioural Insights team. The Behavioural Insights team is a social purpose company, and we solve complex problems through a behavioural lens. And I wanted to reflect tonight on how BIT is integrating behavioural science and AI, and again, particularly generative AI for the purpose of this discussion. And the way I've been thinking about this is really on an arc from the very practical and, if you like, micro integrations and applications of generative AI through to the meso, and then the really kind of macro societal implications for what this means for human AI interactions, what it means for how we go on as a society. So I want to take each of those levels in turn and give you some practical examples of what we've been doing, what we've learnt, and also the many, many open questions that we still have that I hope we can have a really good discussion about tonight. So firstly, thinking about actually the practicalities of how we conduct behavioural research. Here, and I should say across all of these areas, I'm a big enthusiast, but not an evangelist. I think, like Alex, I think there are a lot of risks and things that we should be cautious and thoughtful about. But thinking about how we conduct behavioural research day to day, I think some of the really promising areas, firstly, how we go about reviewing the evidence base and being able to do that in a much more efficient way. We just completed a project for the Department of Science, Information and Technology, which was looking at the difference between a human-led rapid evidence review and an AI-assisted rapid evidence review. And the headline findings were really encouraging. So overall, the AI-assisted review was about 20% faster and more efficient. But it wasn't a slam dunk. So some of the tasks in the literature review and the evidence review actually took a lot longer with the AI assisted. So for example, that researcher took a lot longer doing their revisions, doing the synthesis, and we also saw at the end that there wasn't a huge overlap in the sources that each of those evidence reviews found. So some promising indications, but also some real open questions about how we integrate AI into evidence reviews and do that in a really high quality way. The second area where we've been exploratory and really trying to innovate is thinking about how we use AI in qualitative research, and particularly to do that at scale. So a couple of things we've done. We've built a custom GPT to build behavioural personas and to build mutually exclusive behavioural personas that are designed really as a starting point for researchers to think about their intervention design. And we're finding that's fueling a lot of creativity and allowing us to get to that point a lot quicker. And again, I think there's a lot of opportunity in that space. And as Alex alluded to, we've also been using AI chatbots to conduct qualitative research as well. So instead of a human interviewer, the person is talking to an AI chatbot as part of a focus group, for example. And again, we're finding we're getting quite good feedback from the participants in that qualitative research about their experience talking to that chatbot, and particularly where they're talking about more sensitive topics. So things like personal health information. It seems they actually feel more comfortable speaking to an AI chatbot than they do sitting across from somebody and feeling awkward or perhaps ashamed about what they're talking about. So again, some really interesting areas to explore, and I think the behavioural scientists of the future, and many of you are in this room, I think will be using AI as a co-pilot for your behavioural research in years to come. The second area that we've been exploring is how we use AI to build better behavioural solutions. So the first generation of behavioural interventions focused not exclusively, but primarily on static communications. So how could we give information to people in letters, in text messages, and a lot of those were both cost effective and actually effective in terms of changing outcomes. But what we've been experimenting with is whether we can make those interventions more sophisticated, more interactive, more adaptable. So for example, we've just run a trial in Argentina where we were looking to increase the uptake of COVID vaccinations. And we tested the impact of a chatbot that talked to people about where they could get vaccinated, when, the information about the vaccine, any concerns that they had. And we tested that against a classic static test message and then a control group. And we found that the chatbot quadrupled vaccination rates, and it was twice as effective as the static text message. So our estimates were that using the chatbot would increase vaccinations in that study population by about 2,000 doses and about 150,000 doses scaled up across the population. So we're talking about really meaningful impacts here and really taking these behavioural interventions to a new level of scale and impact, and also interactivity and personalisation as well. And then the third, I think most speculative area is really what happens when human behaviour hits AI systems. And, what happens when we are sitting, at our desk, in our homes, on our phones, and interacting with generative AI. And I think we'll come back to later when we're talking about guardrails, some of the observations I've had about the issues that AI companies are grappling with in terms of the type of use cases they have that are really far from straightforward in terms of how to guide that interaction. But a sort of cross-cutting element of this is how we as behavioural scientists can help build trust in AI systems, and also trustworthiness in the systems themselves. And we just finished an experiment where we were looking at people's trust in the use of AI chatbots in public services. And what we found was that just being exposed to those AI chatbots made people more likely to say that they trusted government's use of AI in public services. So some interesting exposure effects there. But there was real variation in the domains of people's lives where they felt comfortable with governments using those types of services and where, in fact, they really didn't. And so happy to come back and talk more about that. But overall, I think there is enormous opportunity to increase the speed, the scale, and the efficacy of behavioural research using AI. And I think there's also some really deep and profound questions about those interactions between human behaviour and AI and what that means for us as humans, what it means for how we go on as a society.
Thank you. So hi everyone, my name is Dario. I'm assistant professor of behavioral science in the Department of Psychological and Behavioral Science here at LSE, and I'm also departmental AI representative, and some of you may know I teach the course called Behavioral Science in an Age of New Technology, for which it became significantly more difficult to update my material since ChatGPT appeared 2 years ago, so maybe I cancel it soon, but I will still continue. So today I will talk about two things. One will be kind of positive vision for behavioral science of the future with AI, and the other one is one concern that I have. So on a positive note, I think that AI could create more equal opportunities in behavioral science. So what do I mean by this? So today, a lot of research on what you can do as an academic, policymaker, or member of any organization is how much money you have and how much funding you can get. This means certain institutions and individual disadvantage. For example, if you come from the global south, you very likely have fewer resources than, for example, some universities in the UK, and that means you can do fewer research, test fewer interesting ideas that you have. Also, it means that you can employ smaller teams and you may not necessarily do the project of the scope that some other researchers might do. But on the other hand, even those people who don't necessarily have the resources, they may have great ideas, they may be working on great topics which are less popular but very groundbreaking topics. So there are all sorts of issues. Now I think that AI could actually help those individuals. How? Well, on the one hand, we have been experimenting for the past year, I personally and other researchers, with creating synthetic human participants. So that essentially means you can create AI versions of human participants and you can do research on them. And this sounds a bit abstract, but it's not actually creating like some small digital humans. It's really you telling AI, for example, GPT, to complete a particular survey or experimental scenario as if it were a human being with specific characteristics. So you can mention gender, age, socioeconomic status, anything else you want. And the insights we have so far is that in some cases those synthetic participants can actually produce findings that are very similar to human participants. So for example, if you ask any questions about moral views or sustainability, there is a strong correlation between synthetic participants and actual human participants. So we are talking about correlations of 0.8 or 0.9. For those of you who don't know about effect sizes, so correlation effect sizes range from 0 to 1, and 1 means extremely strong. 0.8 and 9 is very strong, something that we rarely ever get in psychology and behavioral science. So basically very strong similarity between human and synthetic participants. One area where it's still not that precise is predicting the outcome of behavioral interventions. So for example, testing the same behavioral interventions you want to test on humans, whether they would work on synthetic participants. This is where we still get some discrepancy, but generally speaking, I think findings are promising. So in the future, if we do manage to get this line of research to a certain high degree, and if we do manage to show that synthetic participants are similar to human participants in many different circumstances, various researchers, regardless of how much funding they have, will be able, for example, to test their ideas and intervention on synthetic participants while working on their ideas, and then eventually maybe even through this route get more funding to test them on humans. But this will of course help everyone who doesn't have much funding. Also, because AI can be used to automate various things and processes, people who cannot employ a huge team and who traditionally may not be able to work on huge projects, now they have AI to automate analysis, to automate various different processes. So this is one positive development that I see, and I do hope that in the next 5 years there will be more kind of equal opportunities across the world when it comes to behavioral science. There is also the concern that I see. So AI research today is a hype, I think, and everyone has a fear of missing out. So a lot of people are basically trying to do some AI-related research. And I think that is positive because it can ultimately advance the capacity of AI to understand human behavior. But it's also dangerous because I fear that some people, for this reason, may abandon some other very important topics that would otherwise be studied. So in behavioral science, for example, we have kind of good understanding of what I would call small behavioral changes, so how to influence someone to pay the tax, but we don't necessarily have a good understanding of basically when people radically change. So when someone lives a particular lifestyle, let's say someone is drinking, smoking, gambling, and then they decide to completely switch, and they stop doing any of these things, they find some meaning in their life. So that would be one example. Another example is, let's say you live a lifestyle that is fully unsustainable. I'm talking about ecological sustainability. And then you downsize, you become vegetarian, you start using only sustainable travel and much more. So we don't have a very good understanding of those type of drastic changes. And yet I think those type of drastic changes are very important in today's world, because I think a lot of challenges that we have, from sustainability to inequalities, they will require drastic behavioral changes. And my fear is that AI may distract behavioral scientists from researching those important topics. So the way I like to present it to myself is I like to see AI as methodology, and I think AI as methodology should never become an aim in itself. It should be the tool that we can use to solve these other more important behavioral problems and to advance scientific knowledge of these more important behavioral problems. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, thank you very much. Thank you for organizing this, and thanks that we get so many people to come and listen to us for such a long time. So as promised, I'm the last one to go, and then we're going to go to questions. I'm going to try and keep it short on the things that I thought I would talk about. So my name is Oliver Hauser. I'm a professor of economics at the University of Exeter. I'm also deputy director for the Institute for Data Science and AI. I'm also in an advisory capacity for the government. So I work in the Cabinet Office as a senior specialist advisor in the evaluation task force, which I'll come back to in a minute. That's one of the points that I want to make. So one of the things that I wanted to talk about is we've heard a lot about the positives of it, and don't worry, I'm generally fairly positive. But I feel like if you keep hearing that, we're not going to get to some of the other stuff that I'm sure you'll also be concerned about. So I have, for the last 8 years, nearly 10 years now, worked on machine learning, AI, and this is, to Robert's point, much more the old school AI that you can use to make very good predictions, very large scale. And we've been able to use that in the public sector to identify fraud. We've been able to use this in more sort of constrained environments in a lab to design policies that are very effective. But since generative AI really hit the ground running about 2 years ago, it has changed everything. And I think at that moment, people no longer talked about, wouldn't it be nice if we have AI to help us do things? People always talk about it's going to be a transformative technology that's going to change our lives, society, the economy, and ideally all in a very, very positive way, which may well happen. But I think it's important to say that at this point, AI is potentially going to be a transformative technology. It's not something that we should take as guaranteed and something we should expect to see happen automatically. So there's a lot to still prove whether technology can live up to the standard that we want. Now, I'll give you a quick example that some of you might think about 20-something years ago now when the internet came along. A lot of predictions were going to say the internet is going to make it much less likely that there's going to be discrimination around because you have anonymous profiles. It said we're going to have a much more harmonious place because people will be in touch with people from all around the world. There'll be less polarization. And unfortunately, we've not got some things quite right. If you look around, some of the designs and the tools that have been set up have unfortunately not increased human well-being or welfare. And that's because I think we didn't think early on enough about how the technology is going to interact with the humans, and some of the people already made their point on this panel. So one of the things that's quite important is to figure out where are the benefits and where are the risks of AI. And I think the number one way we can do this is, rather than assume we build a new technology and we're going to implement it because it will lead to better outcomes, we have to test it in a very, very rigorous way. And the reason I'm saying this is because if you think about any medical innovation, in particular any medication, we expect a lot from that because it can change lives if it works. So we run it through a clinical trial, we do RCTs, we try to put it up to the best scientific standards. But when you look around all of your phones right now, or any of the companies you work with, and even some of the governments who are very much in the fear of missing out, they are trying to implement as fast as possible and maybe not testing this rigorously. So part of my plea would be that as AI develops, I think we need to assume for now it's a potentially transformative technology until it's tested and we really know where it works and for whom. Which brings me to the next point, which is to think about some of the work that we've been doing recently on the more generative AI side, to think about like where do we think the benefits are going to be. So one example that we have done recently is a study in the lab, or sort of online lab, I guess you would call it, where we gave people, this was right at the beginning of ChatGPT, so not everybody had access to it immediately, so we gave them either no ChatGPT or access to one idea from it or 5 ideas, and we asked them to write a story. And they could click a button to say, give me an idea, a starting point for an idea. They could click it once, and in the other condition, you could click it up to 5 times. The first thing to note about humans, you give them a button, they click the button, because we like clicking buttons. Why wouldn't you try out and see what AI does? So 9 out of 10 people click the button, which is convenient for us because it means lots of people now have an idea in front of them. When given the opportunity of a technology, people don't ask, they use it. So then we look at what happens to the writing task. So we let them write a little story, we give it to 600 other people that evaluate that story on all sorts of measures of creativity that psychologists have developed over time, and we find that those stories written with access to AI are a little bit more creative. Not by much, by about 5 to 8%. Now, that's, on the one hand, you might walk away saying, hey, look, AI just does so much for us, and it will make us more creative. But there's 2 caveats to that. The first one is that we find it doesn't actually push our boundaries of creativity beyond what we're able. So when we look at the baseline creativity of participants, those people who are already inherently creative are not benefiting at all from giving them access to ChatGPT. Those who are less creative, they really start to see benefits. So it does level the playing field, but we haven't pushed beyond what humans are capable of right now. And the second point is, when we start looking at the conditions and the stories that came out of it, the stories written with AI, when we use word embeddings, so a much more objective look at how unusual and rare it is, we find stories written with AI are much more similar to each other than those without. And that has 2 reasons, and as behavioral scientists, you might appreciate that. The first one is, I give you an idea, it doesn't have to be AI, anybody gives you an idea, your mind starts to attach to it, it anchors on it. And it's going to be really hard for you to get away from that. And the second one is that, as an implication of that, if you think about how AI and generative AI is built, obviously it's trained on a vast amount of data, but on average, it's going to take from the average in the middle of a distribution, because there's a lot more data. So what comes back is quite similar looking for everybody, which means the output that everybody generates is more homogeneous, and we're losing out on the outliers of a distribution, that the outliers of wild ideas that maybe we need in society occasionally. So with that in mind, I think one of the things that behavioral scientists also have to do is they don't only have to bring the toolkit of randomized controlled trials to test things. I think we also need to bring our understanding of human behavior already and make sure that when we use AI, we do it in a way that it adds to our human capacity, enhances it, rather than exacerbate certain behavioral biases that we know exist in all of us. But unfortunately, at the moment right now, I think we're making too much of a quick decision to try and move ahead, that I think part of the next challenge for the people in the room is to figure out ways that we don't fall into the traps that AI could set up, but also, or in particular, try and change the game so that it helps us. So with that, I'm handing back to you.
Perfect. So I there's kind of 2 broad questions, and I won't necessarily do it sequentially, so either jump or else I'll pick on somebody if in the unlikely event that it's quiet. But what I loved about that was I think too often, and we found this a little bit when you were talking about literatures like behavioural economics in the 2000s, you would have hours and hours of discussion about doom scenarios or broad ideological aspects of it, but you'd have almost nothing about what's actually going to happen. And I felt what was really useful about this was I heard, I think for the first time, a really coherent set, or coherent is the wrong phrase, but very rich set of applications, things that are, you know, going to happen, assuming relatively benign actors working in research agencies, governments, companies, etc., doing, you know, relatively normal things with these technologies that, you know, I think is reasonable to think could be transformative in some of the areas, or certainly will be used and tried. So I thought that was absolutely fantastic. And maybe I just kick it open. Is there any particular areas, you know, if we think about behavioural science teams or people working in that sort of space, or people that would be broadly influenced by that area, are there any particular applications that you're excited by beyond what you've said, or anything that you see as being, bearing in mind there's hundreds of people in the room who are working in the area or about to work in the area, are there any areas where you say, bearing in mind forecasting is very difficult to do, but in the next 5 years you think these are going to be becoming increasingly normal and are particularly promising? So still focusing mostly on the upsides, yeah.
Well, it's a really good question. I think you make a very good point about, and I think it's kind of reflected what's been said, is that there's AI as a kind of tool that just enhances, and in some cases massively enhances your productivity, the efficiency, the speed, lowers the cost of things. There's that sort of, you might see it as quite mundane aspects of automation, if you like. And then there's the sort of really exciting stuff about how AI can transform the way we think about the world, enable us to do things that would never have been possible otherwise. And I think both of those are potentially areas that you could see things going really well, also quite badly. And you know, we just don't know. I suspect they'll go pretty well by and large, because that's, you know, human development takes that course generally, not always. But I think in terms of, say, the next 5 years, I may be wrong, but I think the way I see it, looking at our own work and the work that I see of others and how people are using AI, I think it's more likely to be the former, where you see the sort of quiet revolution of stuff being done better at scale, more of it, and so on. But for that, I think there's going to have to be a rapprochement in some way between the generative AI that you see in large language models, which deal with language, which is inherently ambiguous and context sensitive, and the other kind of AI, the sort of algorithmic AI and machine learning, which requires clarity about things and uses data. And I think, you know, to sort of keep plugging on about something, but I think ontologies are potentially a way of achieving that. So there is work beginning to be done now on how you harness ontologies to drive more precise and sort of data-driven generative AI. So I think that could be a big area.
I've written, I mean, the quiet revolution of stuff being done better is, I'll credit you with that when we summarise that afterwards, but yeah, absolutely fantastic. So, yep.
You go first, Alex.
You sure?
Yeah.
I'll be quick. I'll be quick this time. I've got 2 examples, Liam. So I think one is very practically in the domain of programming. So I'll give you an example. My sister is a nurse at Great Ormond Street, just up the road. I'm not sure which direction it is. She's just started a course on health informatics, and she is dealing with programming for the first time. She can't afford tuition, and she's now using GPT as a tool to help her program, which is incredible. So Dario, to your point earlier, that democratization and that accessibility to ways of doing research that she otherwise never would have had, I think is brilliant. So I'm also personally excited about that as well, because my programming skills aren't necessarily the best. The second is how personally I use it to help me reason. So I did a lot on the judgment decision-making literature, learned a lot about, or trying to learn a lot about how you know, what are the best techniques and methods to debias decision-making, you know, group decision-making, individual decision-making in organisations, personally. So I'm really excited about the potential of LLM tools to help us think the opposite, help us think about similar cases where these decisions have been made before, to open up beyond what we, as Oliver said before, what we naturally anchor on. So those 2 things I'm super excited about.
So I have one that's a bit more left field. I'm kind of looking at the demographics of this room, and maybe like me, you're quite fascinated about AI and dating. So I think this is going to transform how people date. So there is a AI chatbot in China that has 60 million boyfriends. So 60 million young men in China are dating this AI chatbot. Now, that brings up some pretty profound questions about, does that make it less likely that those young men will have a real life girlfriend or boyfriend because they just want to interact with an AI chatbot as their significant other? Or actually, might it make them a better boyfriend when they do have a real life relationship because they've learned empathy, they've learned how to have a conversation. There's some real potential here for actually kind of teaching people how to date and how to connect with other people. And similarly, I think the idea of having an AI co-pilot that you could say, these are my preferences on a dating app, like, can you have the first conversations with 20 people for me and come back with, actually, you should go on dates with these 3 people. I think it's very efficient. And, we saw a wave of, the change in social dating with the event of online dating apps, but I think this will change it again, and I think each of you of that demographic should take quite a keen interest in that.
There you go. Oh, sorry, did I see another hand? Or Susan,
Well,
yeah, go ahead.
I can be really boring here.
Great, you look boring.
I really think it's important to think about the difference between generative AI and, as Robert was saying, machine learning and algorithmic AI, because one is dealing with real-world data and evidence, and that's what we're trying to build as scientists, and the other is dealing with words that anybody's written, scraped off the World Wide Web. And, I first put in, I thought, oh, okay, who is Susan Michie? Well, first of all, I was from the University of Central Lancashire, UCL, and apparently I've got an OBE. No, never will. And so, there is the issue about accuracy. And actually, we were having a conversation before about you saying, using generative AI, well, it's much quicker. And I said, yeah, but it was at higher quality, and there's no benchmark, there may be, but that you use. So there's no point just doing things quicker if what's coming out is not right. And also you can't judge whether it's right or it's not right, which is even worse. And that's why I think transparency is really important, understanding what's going on, because at the moment you don't understand what's going on when you're using it, and that's incredibly dangerous. So that's one way in which I'm going to be boring. The other way in which I'm going to be boring is to say about an application, which I think is reducing the waste of research investment. Mm-hmm. Huge amounts of our research investment are wasted, totally wasted. So just thinking about evaluations of behavioural interventions, more than 100 are published every week. What are we doing with that? We're not getting the knowledge, we're not getting the wisdom from that because we're not using AI. But that's not generative AI. That would be useless. That wouldn't help us in that situation. Many years ago, I did a review of theories of behaviour change with very strict criteria for what is behaviour and what is a theory, and identified 83 theories of behaviour change. People can't work with that. Plus, they were pretty well all underspecified, really poorly specified. All those arrows between boxes, what are those arrows? and massively overlapping, and most of them were partial. This is something where AI can help to integrate that, and actually we're doing a project at the moment integrating all of that by representing it ontologically so it's computer readable. All of this will make our science much more efficient, and I think that's what I'm interested in. So, there are 2 different conversations going on here, I think. Mm-hmm. One is about how to use AI to make behavioural science better and more productive and more useful, and the other is about how do we use generative AI as a kind of adjunct of what we're doing as researchers. And I think they're both really important, but I do think they're very different.
And I can let others come in on that first point, but I wanted to specifically go on that one. So Dario, go ahead, yeah.
Well, I'm just waiting until when AI will be able to correct all university assignments for myself. But joking aside, I do think actually, as an academic, I think generative AI could help with marking fairness, because if you have like large classes, few hundreds of students, you can mark it as a human, but then you can tell AI to go through these assignments to see if there are any inconsistencies. Did some get a lower mark with a similar feedback? So I think there will be actually potential to increase fairness a bit. That's one good opportunity that I see. Another one is just, I don't know if that's positive, but personalization. AI will allow for increased personalization, so understanding human preferences to a greater degree, and allow us to create more tailored interventions and also more dynamic interventions in the form of conversational chatbots. I am more skeptical about this direction because, of course, this can be used for positive purposes, but also many companies can use it negatively. And I do think there will at some point be some human resistance where people will try to understand how to defend themselves against AI. I mean, even today, for example, you can read people's characteristics from facial images using AI. You can infer with a good probability someone's political orientation, sexual orientation, and there are already some kind of attempts with image contamination. So how do you contaminate your images so that AI cannot process those images? So I think basically as AI advances, also human attempts to basically try to conceal their behavior and preferences will also enhance, because as humans we like to preserve freedom.
Yeah. I think I'm not going to add too much because I wanted to actually talk about the tailoring of interventions. I think that's very powerful. It can use a lot of the data that's already out there, and I think we can make the journey for particular people, maybe not on the private sector, but think of the public sector. If you're in the NHS website and you're trying to find out something, having a sort of tailored journey of helping you find the information you're looking for as a behavioral intervention, that's very powerful. That can really stick with people, and I think that's an opportunity where through AI we will be able to make those sort of interventions more memorable, more sticky, and hopefully more impactful in leading to behavior change. And the other one I wanted to bring out, though, that I think is interesting is that we currently, at least, have no good understanding of how AI actually sort of thinks, right? You've probably heard about the black box of the AI machinery, and the reason for that is that there's a lot of neural nets that are running in the background, whether you're taking sort of the more traditional view of machine learning and then adding your neural nets into that and into deep learning, all the way to generative AI, which builds on all of that machinery and has even more of that. And people are rightly a bit scared of that, and I think a lot of behavioral scientists could actually help a lot with reasoning through and helping the machine reason through what's happening under the hood. Because that's exactly what behavioral scientists have been doing for a long time, trying to understand human behavior and trying to understand motivations and chain of thought. And so I think there's going to be a lot about that in a machine as well that I think is going to be an exciting area. If you haven't seen the latest announcement from ChatGPT and OpenAI on their chain of thought machinery, you can go through it. It's actually quite interesting to see how they have advanced this technology, and in particular what they're doing, and this is, I think, quite telling, maybe goes back to a very human trait as well. When we make decisions very quickly, we're not always accurate. And the same turns out is true for a lot of the LLMs. So when you give it a very complicated problem to solve or trying to be very accurate, because they have to run through a lot of computations, they'll make the best prediction. But they don't challenge. It doesn't challenge itself. And this chain of thought experiment that they're running is to figure out how we can teach machines kind of reasoning through those problems. That's exactly what we're trying to do with humans as well. And it turns out it takes longer. So this particular AI operation won't take half a second as you're used to right now. It'll take a few seconds or maybe a few minutes. But maybe that's also, again, an opportunity for the behavioral scientists in the room to think about both what we can learn about AI and what we can learn about human behavior as well.
Great. So I'm going to start going into the questions online, and then we'll take a couple of rounds of questions in person. So I'm going specifically to the ones online because many people are asking the question I was about to ask anyway. So thank you to BJ and a number of other folks who ask about. And I want to take Susan's point into account here, that we can think of the sort of ethics of different types of uses of things like chatbots to do malevolent things, and I'm absolutely fine for us to discuss that and bring it in. But I do think, given the theme of the night, I want to talk a bit more specifically about your behavioural researchers or your behavioural team of some type in the public sector, private sector, and let's say broadly speaking, you're trying to create scientific knowledge to influence behaviour. So in that context, what are the sort of ethical guardrails? Now, as I said, we can go on to, like, if bad actors are trying to do completely terrible apocalyptic things with the technology and so on. So I'm thinking more in cases where, broadly speaking, people are trying to solve problems of the type we've been speaking about, and they're integrating AI, machine learning, or indeed they're using chatbots in some ways as tools. What would be the sort of main things that would come to your mind from a sort of guardrail or an ethical perspective in that context?
I think
yeah.
one of the ones for me is almost the idea of a circuit breaker. So because of the way some of these large language models, again, I feel like we should broaden out at some point, Robert. But the way those models are trained, they're designed to please you and to serve you and to give you an answer. And the idea of if there is a chatbot, you know, in the course of a chatbot conversation, if there's a way to build in a circuit breaker that can detect actually someone doesn't understand, or they're kind of signalling vulnerability, that it can stop and call in a human, for example, that would be one idea. The second is around this is more from a research or scientific perspective, but how do you replicate the replication? Because again, the way these outputs are so inconsistent, it's the kind of, how do you replicate?
So I think we've been thinking particularly about how we build closed custom GPTs so that we can feel a lot more confident about the veracity of the outputs that are coming out of it and the types of sources that they are drawing on, particularly where they're being released to the public. And as Alex said, you then face a number of practical and ethical challenges. I think it's also interesting the regulatory framework around this is still really very nascent, and I think it's worth us also thinking through what are the use cases where actually we don't think the application of particularly LLMs and generative AI is appropriate. And having conversations with some of the AI companies over the past few months, they're grappling with these live issues around this point where you have the human AI interaction, and a lot of people inside these companies are very sophisticated researchers, but they're not particularly behavioural researchers, so they're not thinking deeply about what is the human behaviour on the other side of that interaction. They're thinking more about what's going into the model itself. And so the types of use cases they're grappling with are things like, if you were to go on to one of these chatbots and say, who should I vote for in the 2024 US presidential election? What should the chatbot come back with? Like, should it just shut that conversation down straight up? Should it point you to verified sources about how to vote in an election or the parties? Should it try and engage you on what your preferences and values are? And that's a really difficult set of questions. And those use cases only escalate, I think, when you think about other scenarios, like if someone was to go on to a chatbot and say, I'm feeling really low and I'm thinking about hurting myself. Like, how would I do that? Again, does the chatbot just shut that down? Does it point that person to help, a helpline or some kind of emergency service? Or does it try and have an empathetic conversation with that person? And these are really profound questions, and they are, in different shades, behavioural questions as well about how that interaction happens. So I think that's an interesting area for all of us.
Yeah, I'd go back to what I said before about not understanding what's going on. I mean, we know when we collect data, say, using surveys, that the way we construct surveys, the way we use the language and the questions, the order in which the questions come, etc., will influence the outcome. And there's a science of it. So when we get responses, we can evaluate those responses and we can think, is there something about the methodology that could account for these responses? When it comes to using generative AI, we've got no idea what's going on under the bonnet. And whoever's producing, the generative AI can have all sorts of agendas that we don't know about. So this is an unknown, an unknowable technology from our point of view. It's actually not unknowable. It could be. Everything could be open source. All that code could be open source. So I'd say it's unethical to have this kind of technology and not have it open source, first of all. Secondly, one of the problems is, yes, it's scraping words, and all these words are being presented. So all these words are going out into the scrapable web generated by generative AI. And so it goes on, you know, and so this is another thing that we don't have control over. We should have understanding, we should have control, we should have choice, we should have all of these things. Another thing I want to, just a completely different issue, sustainability. We all care about sustainability. What are we doing using generative AI? It takes huge amounts of energy and huge amounts of water to cool down the energy that we're using. We think it's all free because we sit there and we do all this stuff. It's not. It's costing enormous amounts of precious resources whilst the world is, you know, going to hell in a basket because of, you know, the real lack of resources where resources should be. So I think that's a massive ethical issue we should all be aware of. And I very rarely heard it discussed in, you know, meetings such as this.
Yeah, absolutely fascinating. So along with the upsides, like the potential for very expensive climate unneutral technology untransparently influencing people's behaviour in ways that could be shaped by agendas that they can never know, is probably less optimistic than the first round of questions. But I think, given some of the questions coming in, I think maybe we just go to the audience and then the others can come in on that one. So what I'll do is I'll take 3 questions at a time. Sorry to do it like that, but it's the only hope we have of getting through a decent group. So yourself in the front, and I'll go around the room a little bit. Yes, that gentleman up there, and maybe take one more from this side, and that gentleman there. So yeah, so if you start with that. Yeah, yourself just in the third, just one back, sorry, yeah.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
My name is Kshitija. I'm an economist by training and a data scientist by profession. So one of the questions which I always struggle with is if you look at all the large language models, they are all in English, right? All the big large language models are in English. And when we look at the inequality or the issues with facing global south, and will, you know, the introduction of more AI, large language models, is it going to bridge the gap or going to widen the gap? I always wonder, because if you look at any of the global south countries, there are a lot of problems. Like I can talk about India because I come from there, a lot of problems to be solved, right? Women's health issues, it could be farmers looking for a more competitive price for their produce. But unfortunately, what stops is we do not have a large language model in Hindi, or India has 26 languages, right? We do not have models to suit all languages. So just would like to get your views on
Perfect.
that.
And then just that gentleman there in the blazer, who I know to be Martin, but just to keep it
Could I play the Luddite for a moment? My name is Martin Baum. I'm a social psychologist in the same department as Dario, and I teach the alternative course to Dario. Dario gathers the enthusiasts, I gather the Luddites. My question is the following. I'm having a paper in front of me which reviews an event that happened in 1971 when the American Congress called for an investigation committee onto the nefarious activity of behavioral science, basically dealing with behavior modification in the military, in mental health hospitals, in prisons. And they came to conclusion after 3 years that what is necessary, that we need not to improve the effectiveness and the speed of behavior modification, but to strengthen the agency of the subject. So my question to the panel is, do we need such an investigation into the nefarious activities of successful, scaled-up behavioral modification in the 21st century, or why not?
Perfect.
Why don't we need that?
It was just that one third question then. Yeah, sorry, just that gentleman in the white shirt. No, yeah, perfect. Thank you, sorry. My pointing is always, I need to get an AI to help me with that, but good.
Can't
Could you just
hear.
speak up a little, maybe the mic is... Perfect.
My question is related to hallucination, which is currently an issue, but the next people are talking about deception. Is there a difference between hallucination and deception, and can the current state of the art of behavioural science help work out what deception is?
Great, so we've got language, agency and deception, and I'm happy to... Yeah, Robert, you want to go first?
Language one is tremendously important. I think, so we've just come back from Tokyo where we were visiting a behavioural science group there who are working with generative AI both in English and in Japanese. And so in principle, generative AI works with tokens. So the tokens can be anything, they can be symbolic of whatever. So I think that's perfectly reasonable and possible, and it's really a matter of investment. And so that the technology can work perfectly fine. But I also think that, and this is going to be tricky, but physics has essentially a universal language, the language of mathematics or whatever. I think that in behavioural science, we should move towards a universal language, whatever that is, but recognising that universal language will have to bring in cultural specificities, because there are linguistic and cultural specificities not only across countries and regions but within countries. And so the whole area of cultural specificity is tremendously important for us as behavioural scientists, where most of our science is about a minority of the world's population. I completely agree. I'll just move straight to the last question quickly. I completely agree with you that one of the potential, if we do it, one of the potential advantages of AI is in helping people to achieve agency. Because one of the things we can do with well-motivated people working in behavioural sciences is to use AI to bring out and make transparent all the kind of tricks and devious things that are going on all the time and have been going on since time immemorial. And I think that's one of our challenges. So I think that AI actually potentially has the chance of helping us with that, but it's also something which could go the other way. But it requires motivation and incentivization for us to do.
I'm happy to go next.
Yeah,
So I guess one of the things that I wanted to bring, I guess the way I read your question about agency, maybe to start with that one, is that I think that in the 71, I think whenever the meeting was, there's absolutely a concern that has been brought up a lot about behavioral science, this idea of manipulation and the way that some decision maker at the top can manipulate behavior somewhere further down without that person realizing it. And I think that fear shouldn't go away, because it can certainly still exist. But there has been a long debate about this, about nudging in particular, but also in general, like what is the role of the state, but also any social planner in trying to make sure that you still maintain that agency for an individual. I think your point is that something around that should probably be happening around AI. What's quite interesting is that in AI, because of this sort of FOMO that every company has, we're probably jumping a lot of steps ahead. I think that there isn't at the moment the biggest discussion around preserving agency for individual decision makers. I think it's much more around trying to find the potential use of the technology because people think that it's going to help you down the line. Now, there's plenty of examples, of course, when people try to sell you something online and they use AI to do that you can see it doesn't always align with your preferences. But I actually think we do need good regulation. And I think it's both on the policy side, but also in an academic debate, that I think it would be quite interesting to see what are sort of the bottom-up approaches around agency that we haven't seen that are unique to AI. To be honest, I don't think they're going to be that much different. I think in many ways, what we've learned about manipulation that would be possible on the behavioral science side, you just have to think like a very super powerful machine could do something even stronger. So the same guardrails need a stronger defense in many ways. And I think on the last point, I understood the question around hallucination and deception in a very interesting, I hadn't thought about it like this, but I think it goes back to Susan's point around, we don't know what the policymaker that is sitting, or let's not call them policymakers, because for a moment let's just keep the fact that there's a lot of private companies. Those companies are developing a product that they want you to use, right? And they want to please you, they want to make sure that the chatbot is developing or is delivering something that you come back to. In many ways, nothing too different, I guess, from social media that's trying to keep you coming back to as well. And in many ways, there could be an incentive to start not just hallucinating randomly on a probability that is generated by the big text that's out there, the corpus of text that is trained on. Every time you see a word in these LLMs, it's a predictive process. I think the difference between hallucination, where this happens, and deception is that this process is steered in one direction. And that would be in the direction of whoever is making the decision in the LLM to build in incentives for them to either for you to come back to, or to sell you something, or just to, again, going back to questions around manipulation, to steer in that direction. I think the difference between hallucination at the moment would probably be that it's still a bit random, but deception isn't.
Folks, we got, I think, an answer to the three of those. So I think what I'll do is just take three more, just so that we can kind of get it spread around the audience a bit more. So maybe just a couple more hands. So one there, one there, and one there. So I'm sorry, I'm making the job hard for the guys. We have first down here. I hope you're wearing your Garmins to check your step counts, Sophia.
Hi, good evening. So my question is more in terms of policy making. I think more recently, with the advent of machine learning and being able to use AI more cheaply, companies are really able to sort of understand what is their profit-making activities and what are the value-making activities. So what for a customer might be valuable is not necessarily profitable for the company. So the company might want to sort of maximize the amount of profit whilst minimizing the amount of value which is costly to them. How do you, as policymakers, make sure that companies are being protected in terms of their profit margins, but are not manipulating people too much, such that it's really hijacking their behavioral, I would say like behavioral mechanisms, such that they're overusing or using it in a very improper way for their health?
Brilliant. And just that lady. Sorry, gentleman there. Yeah, just where the hand is up there, yeah.
Thank you. Globally, the best evidence suggests that the rise in youth loneliness and anxiety is being driven by social media. In my home country in the US, I know that it is leading to increased rates of suicide and suicide attempts among our youth in Gen Z and Gen Alpha. And the power of social media comes from the algorithms, machine learning. I don't hear social media talked about much in the context of AI, and is artificial intelligence just going to drive that further and make it more addictive?
Perfect. And then one final question just on this side. Where was the hand? Hand has gone back down, so yeah, you can go for it basically. Sorry.
Thanks. So my question is like, today's generative large language models have a lot of restrictions. Like, it is very difficult to generate hate speeches or anti-social content. And we all know that there are a lot of discussions like whether these companies that produce these models should also restrict the data that will be fed into the model. So that means basically the large language models tend to give responses that are good responses and that's generally acceptable by general public. So in this case, how can you justify that these large language models are useful when you conduct behavioral science, that you might study different behaviors of humans?
Great. So we've got companies and exploitation of consumers, and then mental health, loneliness among young people, and a fascinating question I hadn't thought about, which is in terms of the role of the data restriction and whether that limits the applicability to those sort of questions.
I'm happy to take, so just on that first question around the balance between profit and manipulation, I think a really interesting area to look at of regulation is in financial services, where the FCA, so the Financial Conduct Authority, has, previously most regulators regulate against rules, and the FCA, was it last year, the year before, brought in outcome-based regulation. So specifically as part of that, they look at the outcomes that firms drive. So what's the impact of a firm's activities on customers, the outcomes they get? How are those outcomes distributed across different consumers within the customer base? And critically, there's a part of that regulation that looks at price and value. So what is the value? What's the cost that it takes the firm to produce that particular product? Is the price that's being charged, is that cost reflective? And critically, what value, which is not necessarily always a financial or economic value, what value does the customer or the groups of customers get? So I think that's a really interesting, broadly outcome-based regulation to look at and think about in the context of AI. And just on that question around, is there a risk that AI can make social media more addictive? My intuition would be absolutely yes. And again, I think coming back to regulation, the problem at the moment is that there is, for tech companies, a competitive advantage because of the way markets work and what consumers are responding to, that there's an incentive for them to make their products more addictive. So again, here I see a really critical role for regulation to minimise the harm of these products. Yeah.
I agree, and I think both of you are right to be concerned about it because we're in an age of industrial level experimentation and algorithmic targeting, and a lot of that is directed towards identifying and in cases manipulating and exploiting our cognitive biases. And I think there is a massive imbalance in many markets between the power that we have as consumers and the power that companies have, with our data, with what we're doing on those platforms or with those companies. So I think we really need regulators and policymakers to be on our side and to be on our side in a really muscular way. I think the good and hopeful news there is that the provisions in the new Online Safety Act and also the Digital Markets Act are some of the strongest that we've ever had in this country in terms of the powers that those regulators, the CMA and Ofcom, have to both investigate and regulate tech platforms, but also digital markets companies as well. So,
you go for it. So go ahead. So to me, this first question was similar to the question about agency that Martin asked. So was the link basically between influence and agency? And the question is, so how do we define agency? Well, we can say that people who are making very quick decisions without thinking, we could say that they are basically not really using their agency. And we could say that people who try to take a bit more time, reflect on their important goals and think about pros and cons, that they basically are using their agency. So I think when it comes to kind of setting up large language models to basically increase the amount of agency and minimize kind of potential of influence, I think they will need to basically prompt people to reflect a bit more about their decisions and to take into consideration their goals and some other circumstances rather than basically allowing them to just make some form of quick decisions. Whether that's achievable if policy making is difficult to say, but I think it needs to be the emphasis on kind of large language model, prompting people to a bit more using their reflecting reasoning. Now talking about mental health and social media, there is actually evidence which shows that artificial agents, so conversational artificial agents, can actually decrease loneliness. So if you have people who are basically lonely, talking to them, it can drastically decrease loneliness. And even if you look at worldwide, loneliness is a huge problem. Many people, especially older people, don't have someone to take care of them, don't have someone to talk to. And AI, as much as kind of artificial as it sounds, it could actually help those people to have someone to talk to and to feel a bit happier. Now talking about the negative influence of social media, as I said a bit earlier, I think there will be some kind of growing resistance of people trying to build some kind of software which will prevent AI from influencing them. So we know that a lot of websites use dark patterns. So dark patterns are really some form of techniques of influence. They're trying to influence you as a consumer to take some course of action that you may not necessarily be happy with. But I've already seen that there is like a software that tries to identify dark patterns on a website and then basically block those dark patterns from influencing you. And I think there may be more and more such software which would basically be resistance, trying to block AI and warning people about how AI might be trying to influence them. I really think that will increase in the future.
Yeah. I'd like to add one more thing on sort of building the points that were said so far, and obviously I should have said from the beginning, I'm not obviously allowed to say anything on behalf of a government, so I'm not going to say this is anything that I think the government would do, but I think in general what governments might want to do is broaden out the scope of how do you think about value and profit. And in particular, because it's an arms race right now for a lot of companies to increase their profit margins, even if it comes at a cost of the consumer's welfare, there's no incentive for these individual companies to deviate. Right? It's a classic social dilemma. And I think there's some hope in that. First of all, I think the FCA regulation in the UK in itself was a very good thing to happen, not just for AI, but in general for products and for consumers, for consumers that the products are built in a way that do add value. The online safety bill, the AI bill, EU has a similar bill. The problem arises when other governments don't pull their weight and some in the world don't. Because I think if they all align the regulation in a way that makes it for each individual company to say, we can step back a little bit, then I think you can still maintain profits, but you can also maintain integrity and value for the consumer. It is the fact that this is an arms race right now that isn't fully regulated at an international scale. And these companies are working at an international scale, so it will require an international response down the line. And I think I'm going to say one last thing on that, which I think is a bit hopeful, that a year ago, the UK actually hosted, or was it 2 years already, the AI Safety Institute or AI Safety Summit, which led to the generation of several AI safety institutes, one of them in the UK, one in the US, and others are coming up as well. And the whole goal is to work with these companies to make sure that the products that are being put out there aren't going to harm and lead to particularly bad harm for society. I think there could be done more. I think Susan's point did open up the black box a bit, even if it's not transparent to everybody in the world, at least to the regulators it should be, to understand what the objective function is, and so we can have a bit of profit, but also protect values for consumers.
Can I just actually, in a way, ask a question? Because I think a lot of the answers that have just been given are about the tension between private profit and the public good. And that's the nature of our society, sadly, in my view. But also, it applies to all new technologies that come along. So my question is, what's so special about AI? Is this just another technology where there's a battle between the public good and private profit? Or is there something intrinsically more dangerous and threatening and intrinsically more game-changing in a public good direction? I think maybe it's just another technology, and all of what's been talked about now could have been talked about any other technology too. And also, we are talking about AI in the future of behavioural science. You know, this is almost AI in the future of society, isn't it? We're talking about
exactly.
that. Yeah.
So actually, my point was going to be very much related to that, and that is we have experience of exploitative technologies that have caused immense damage in society and for which solutions have attempted to be found with some success. And the one that I've mainly worked in most of my career is tobacco. Tobacco is still killing 7 million people a year. The volume of sales in monetary terms of tobacco is as high as it's ever been, and that's despite the fact that in countries like the UK we've seen smoking prevalence go down. Tobacco is incredibly profitable, but it's not because we don't know how to tackle it, it's because the political will hasn't been there across most of the globe. But going to if we were to learn lessons from that, what we've seen is that where we've been successful in tackling the exploitative part, and of course AI has a positive side as well, unlike tobacco, which doesn't in any way, is regulation, very important, intelligent regulation, which is based on a good understanding of behaviour. So, for example, the drive towards low-tar cigarette was a complete red herring because it failed to understand the fact that smokers titrate their nicotine intake and will smoke low-tar cigarettes more intensively and end up with the same level of chemical and toxins. So you need behavioural science to understand how you can regulate. things like capacity building, education, help build right from the get-go. What we should be doing is educating young people to understand AI, to harness AI, to be responsive to it, and to be able to execute their agency in the context of AI. But there's a whole raft of things that are done, and they're actually embodied in the Framework Convention for Tobacco Control. And if that framework were only implemented properly by all countries, we could see a genuine decline. But I think, as Susan says, this isn't, in that sense, this is not new. And there's a lot that behavioural science can do to help us to get the benefits of AI, which are enormous and transformational, but tackle these real risks.
On the subject of being watched over by machines of loving grace, the LSE Events people have just warned me that we should finish right now. Yeah, that 90 minutes just flew by. I've taken 14 pages at least of rough notes. I think when you bring people like this together, there's just so many threads that have emerged and so many things that I hope you'll want to follow up on. It's a real privilege to chair something like this, and I just think we should give our panellists a big round of applause.